Hi guys, and thank you for joining me for another video. In this one you'll see a piece that I painted a while ago in oils. So the original was technically complete, but I didn't really like it, and usually if I create a painting and it doesn't really speak to me, I stick it in a drawer for it to dry, and I look at it, say, after a couple of weeks, and if it still doesn't invoke any positive emotion, if it's just a meh sort of painting, then I might actually move it to another drawer for work in progress pieces, and then when I feel like painting I might pull it out and paint over it. Of course, with oil paint, if you are going to be painting over an older painting, you just have to keep in mind what you've done with it before. So if your original painting is very oily, then painting over it, your newest layers have to be more oily because of the fat over lean rule with oil paintings. So I couldn't really go over it with paint that had been diluted down with terps, for example, because then the underlayer would crack. So anyway, this one was quite interesting because I felt nothing about the original painting that I painted over, but by the time I was finished with it, the piece became one of my all-time favorites, to the point where I didn't actually put it up for sale. I decided to keep it. And while this still happens for me, I still every now and then fall completely in love with a painting and decide not to give it away. It's been happening less and less often, and I've recently actually sold quite a few of my favorite paintings. This one though, I just couldn't bring myself to do that with. Something else that was interesting is that there was no reference. This is completely intuitive. I think that maybe it had something to do with the fact that I end up loving it so much. You'll see that I use a mixture of a palette knife and a very frayed old brush. So I like to show texture with the palette knife, but then I also like my pieces to be a combination between textured and blended, and that's where that frayed brush comes in. And so I'm constantly moving between the palette knife and the brush, and that sort of results in lots of windows. If you ever have the chance to look closely at one of my oil paintings, especially my landscape paintings, you'll see sort of little windows to the layers previous, and I really like that. I think it gives the piece movement, and it makes it more dynamic, and it also makes it interesting enough that every time you look at it you might see something new. So a lot of my landscape paintings do actually have this sort of multi-layered approach. It's very rare that I finish one in one go and I love it so much that I'm not going to add more to it. So you'll see a lot of this sort of layering and texture throughout my landscape pieces. As for when to layer or when to leave things a bit more sketchy and a bit more messy, I think it just depends on the colors that are showing through. So in the bottom, say, left of the painting, I maintained that sort of goldy color, and so I wasn't really going to completely paint over that or to blend too much over that. I wanted to keep that window open, and it's important to always take a step back and have a look at the piece overall, and that sort of helps determine which parts are just perfect enough as they are to be left alone, and which parts are, say, maybe too bright or too dark, and where values need to be sort of fixed. So this painting is done on a 6x6 piece of MDF board, which I cut down to size myself. Until this year or until late next year, I predominantly painted either on wood panels or canvas or paper. But then once I found the MDF boards at my local hardware store, I realized that they were thin enough to frame, and they were thin enough to cut at home. So unfortunately, my hardware store won't cut the pieces down to the size that I want. They will only give these sort of large sizes. But with a bit of determination and the right tools, I could cut them down to the sizes that I needed. And that sort of flexibility is quite important. It means that I can bring in a big board, cut it down to various sizes, prime the panels with the primer that I want to use. So I know about the quality of the panels. I know what they're made of. I know how many layers of primer were used, and I know what kind of primer was used. And then I can just set them aside, and whenever I feel like painting something, I can grab one and then paint over it. And though initially I was a bit worried that my customers may not really appreciate the fact that the pieces are not as thin as paper, but they're not able to be immediately put up the way a frame panel might be, I haven't actually had any issues with selling them. That's because the boards I use are, I think, between 3 and 4 millimeters thick, and that's actually thin enough to be framed using a standard glass frame. So yeah, I think they sort of bridge that gap between the more fragile paper but then the more expensive framed wood panels, and that obviously reflects in the prices of the sold pieces. So I think it's a benefit both to myself and to my buyers. Now, with regards to the primer I just mentioned, I tend to put about 3 layers of standard acrylic primer by, hold on, let me have a look at what I use. I use a Matisse Professional Artist acrylic primer, and then my top 2 layers are actually Michael Harding non-absorbent acrylic primer, which really prevents the oil from seeping into the panel and allows the paint to remain very glossy and luminous. The oil paints, I'm sure I touched upon them in other videos, and I will touch upon them in videos to come, but I use a mixture of the Jackson's in-house oil paint, which are sort of some of my favorites for these immediate work that don't need medium. And for the goldy colors at the moment, I'm very in love with the Gamblin Indian yellow, which I've been using a lot for my landscapes. Anyway, if you do have any questions about this, it's just going to be a quick video, sort of time lapse, but just let me know and I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. And I will also actually link you to the online gallery where my landscapes are sold. So if you're interested in any, please free to have a look there. And while this particular painting isn't for sale, there are a few that are similar that are up there now. So thank you very much for your support as usual. Please like and subscribe. Visit our social media to see other work that both Mara and I are working on, and we'll see you in another video shortly. Thank you.